It's actually a part of our original vocation in Genesis, to till and keep the earth. It's an essential part of our relationship with God, that we care for creation.
Hello and welcome. My name is Rachel, and you're listening to episode 185 of Candid Catholic Convos, a show about Catholicism that enriches your faith, answers your questions, and meets you wherever you're at on your faith journey. Today, we're chatting with Sean Domencic about tactile ways we can be modern stewards of our environment. But first, let's start with Scripture. Today's reading is from Psalm 24, verse 1. Short and sweet, but very weighty. The earth is the Lord's, and everything in it, the world, and all who live in it. This verse reminds us of a fundamental truth we often forget in today's world. Everything belongs to God. The land, the oceans, the animals, the forests, the air we breathe, even us. None of it is ours in the possessive sense. We're not owners. We're stewards. And that changes everything. In a world driven by consumption, convenience, and profit, we can fall into the trap of treating the earth like a commodity instead of a gift. But Psalm 24 calls us to a radically different mindset, one of reverence, responsibility, and gratitude. Being eco-friendly isn't just a buzzword for marketing products, nor does it stop there. This is about living in the right relationship not just with God, but with others and with His creation. Pope Francis calls this integral ecology in Laudato Si', an understanding that everything is connected, and when we harm the environment, we harm the poor, we harm future generations, and ultimately we harm ourselves. As Catholics, our faith calls us to more than just belief. It calls us to action. And Psalm 24 verse 1 is a gentle but powerful reminder that caring for the earth is not optional. It's a way we honor our Creator. So this week, let's ask ourselves, are we living like the earth belongs to God, or like it belongs to us? Today's Saint Spotlight shines on Servant of God Dorothy Day, a 20th century Catholic convert, journalist, and co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement. Dorothy is best known for her radical love of the poor and her firm stance on peace and justice. But what's often overlooked is her deep care for God's creation. She believed that environmental stewardship was inseparable from caring for the poor. She encouraged people to live simply, to grow their own food, and see the land as a gift, not a resource to exploit. Through Catholic Worker Farms, she promoted a lifestyle rooted in community, humility, and respect for the earth. Long before Laudato Si', Dorothy was living Pope Francis's integral ecology, a holistic approach that ties care for the environment directly to human dignity and solidarity. She once said, "The biggest challenge of the day is how to bring about a revolution of the heart. And that includes how we treat the world around us." Dorothy's cause for canonization is still in progress, but her legacy invites us to ask, how can I live more simply and care more deeply, both for the poor and for the planet? With the reminder of Psalm 24 and the example of Dorothy Day, let's move on to our marquee topic. Can you be Catholic and eco-conscious? The short answer is yes, but let's take it a step further. Today we're chatting with Sean Domencic, a lifelong Catholic and part of the Catholic Worker Movement, who took action on Pope Francis's call in Laudato Si' to engage in ecological conversion and spirituality through Ember Tides. Sean, welcome to Candid Catholic Convos. I'm super excited to have you here.
Happy to be here.
Tell me a little bit about Ember Tides. What is that?
Yeah, well, I first encountered them when I was going to the Latin Mass. We have one here at St. Joseph's, and in the old calendar, there are Ember Tides. So those are quarterly seasons, and they're sort of at the turn of the season. So, in spring and in summer and winter and fall. And they're worked into the liturgical calendar. So they follow that. The spring ones are right after Ash Wednesday. The summer ones are just after Pentecost. So they're kind of tied to our regular liturgical seasons. And yeah, just found them, a beautiful devotion. They're traditional fasts, and they used to be fast days in the church, and so started observing them, just personally out of that, finding that a beautiful tradition that I wasn't aware of, but then recognizing too the call in Laudato Si, Pope Francis' encyclical on the environment, to to be engaging in ecological conversion, ecological spirituality. So I was reflecting on that call there, and how I could do that. And so that became something I began to particularly pray with during those seasons, because they were attached historically, like going all the way back, to the early church, to the Middle Ages, when those feasts were widely observed. They were very ecological feasts. They would be times of praying for good weather, praying for good harvests, celebrating the harvest or celebrating the planting. And priests would actually go out in procession and bless the fields of the faithful, or bless the meadows where animals were grazing, stuff like that, which I think, I mean, most Catholics can attest, that those are very separate things. Our church life and where our food comes from, very rarely, would ever be connected, but found it a really beautiful thing. And so, yeah, the Ember Tides, are a great opportunity for that kind of ecological spirituality.
I think it's fascinating how the Catholic Church, we have like traditions for everything, and this is one that I had no idea about until I met you. So I think that this is fascinating. It's yet another way that we can observe God in nature and in every day. And like you said, with Laudato Si, being able to take action the way Pope Francis asked us to, and the way the Church calls us to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's talk a little bit about Laudato Si and what being eco-conscious means, because I feel like when you say eco-conscious, people's antennas go up and they think that we're talking about like something political or something secular. Can you be Catholic and eco-conscious, and what does that look like?
There's a whole section on ecological conversion in that document, and there's a paragraph there that says, the external deserts in the world are growing because the internal deserts have become so vast. And he's quoting Benedict XVI there. And he goes on, for this reason, the ecological crisis is also a summons to profound interior conversion. It must be said that some committed and prayerful Christians, with the excuse of realism and pragmatism, tend to ridicule expressions of concern for the environment. Others are passive. They choose not to change their habits and thus become inconsistent. So what they all need is an ecological conversion, whereby the effects of their encounter with Jesus Christ become evident in their relationship with the world around them. Living our vocation to be protectors of God's handiwork is essential to a life of virtue. It is not an optional or a secondary aspect of our Christian experience. So in many ways, I feel like that speaks right to your question, that yeah, it's actually a part of our original vocation in Genesis, to till and keep the earth. Pope Francis in that document too mentions that obviously we focus a lot on the tilling, where we use our intellect and our will and our capabilities to change the earth, but that also involves keeping, means caring for it and making sure that it's sustained and able to continue to flourish. And that's an essential part of why God made us human beings in this earth. We're not just angels that worship him and glorify him in a bodiless form. We're actually, it's an essential part of our relationship with God, that we care for creation.
I love what you said about how this goes all the way back to Genesis, because I think anymore people think that being eco-conscious is like a fad or it's a new trend, and it's not. It's something that we were built for. Essentially, this is to take care of the earth so that we can continue to live here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have you encountered any sort of challenges or resistance when talking about the faith and in the environment? How is something like Ember Tides or just being an eco-conscious Catholic received overall?
Yeah. I mean, I think that similar to, I mean, what Pope Francis said in that little passage I read, there's definitely those who do see it as something that's just doesn't belong in the faith. That those who see it as, they associate it with secular expressions of sort of environmental politics, and they think, well, that doesn't align with what I understand the faith to be. But I think understanding that it's more certainly it is a political aspect, and there's a lot of political things that are discussed in that document, but it's more than that. It's about, I mean, similar to like the pro-life issue, right? There's laws and everything that can be passed to support unborn babies and to protect them from violence, but there's more than just that, right? It's a whole way of life. It's how do we welcome children? How do we talk about families? How do we support families? When someone has a baby, am I caring for them? All of that is part of being pro-life, right? And in the same way, on the ecological side, it's something that goes a lot deeper than just like what policy choices, even though those are important. So I think that's a difficulty that we're not really trained to think too much about how the faith, what we do on Sunday then affects all of our decisions throughout the week. And I think that really goes to Catholic social teaching in general, right? I think that we often, yeah, we think that it's something that maybe only comes up when it's time to vote, and not something that is actually constantly a question for how do we live our lives. We make purchasing choices, we make choices about, how we treat others in our lives, or how we use our wealth, how we use our resources, all these things.
Can you talk a little bit more about the how, like, what kind of choice, how can we be eco-conscious in our everyday decisions? Like, what little changes can we make to make a larger impact down the road?
Yeah, definitely. Again, well, one thing I definitely encourage, going beyond the scope of this conversation, is for people to read Laudato Si. It's a long document for sure, but it's a really great document, and reading it in full, I think, will give someone a greater picture of what the church is teaching, what the church is guiding us to think about in our decisions. So educating ourselves is definitely key, because if it's not something that we're hearing about, then it's not something we're going to be able to make good decisions on. But as far as some concrete things, something again that's talked about in that document is, in many ways, living a simpler life. Living a life of gospel simplicity, or gospel poverty, as we say. Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor," right? And that doesn't have to mean destitution. Dorothy Day would make this distinction between destitution and voluntary poverty. But we are called to live poverty in a certain way, and something that's talked about a lot in both Laudato Si and other documents going back. JP2 has a great encyclical where he talks about the super development of the first world and the underdevelopment of the third world. And similarly, Laudato Si, it draws on those themes, talks about our ecological debt, talks about how if the consumption of the first world was what everyone did, there wouldn't be enough space on the planet to contain the waste products, right? And so there's many ways in which we can live simpler lives. We can choose not to consume at such a voracious rate, and that could be the kinds of homes we live in, the kind of transportation that we use or base our lives around. It could be just our shopping habits, right? Do we buy local and support those local enterprises and businesses, or do we just get cheap products that are shipped across the entire planet and are made often with workers in difficult conditions? Being conscious of all those things, it relates, of course, to economic justice, all these things, but it is also an aspect of being ecologically minded, because really, I mean, the source that Pope Francis talks about again and again is our current models of growth and consumption are key to the problem.
That's fascinating, and I think you're right. It could be as simple as just shopping local. Like, there's a local farmers market down the street from my house, or I have a friend who works in the film industry, and she's a costume designer, and she's always talking about buying less, especially online, from companies that are in what's called fast fashion.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
the cheap stuff that like gets thrown out quickly because it doesn't last long and it's not a good quality. Little things like that like can make such a big difference, especially for, like you said, for overconsumption. Because it's funny, like when we were moving, I didn't think that we had a whole lot of like stuff, and then you
Hmm.
see it all in one
Yeah,
truck and you're like,
yeah,
oh man.
yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, we try to do some, purging in our house for that purpose, and keeps you, if you try to go through all your things and ask, do I really need this? Am I actually using this? It's been very helpful. But a few concrete things I did want to mention, that are also in Laudato Si, that Pope Francis briefly just touches on, and that have been valuable for our family, has been one. He talks about AC and air conditioning, like just the sort of the use more and more of it. And there's a real place for that, right? There's people with health conditions, there's people who need that, but at the same time, it's not something. I mean, people lived for how many centuries without AC, right? So it's something that we've tried, to simply, set aside. And it has its difficulties on a hot day, right? But it also is much more manageable than we realize, I think. Things like that, and then also, our use of transportation, he discusses a lot too. That we build our lives so that we have to drive everywhere, and that's inescapable. Like we can't control, whether stores are close to us or whether our family is close to us in some cases, but we can make some decisions there. So even, I always find it strange, how often our habit is to maybe drive 20 minutes going past three parishes to the parish that we like best, right? And there can be goods to that, community and stuff. But then there's also the element of, am I building my life, choosing to live, choosing to work, choosing to worship in ways that are integrated, where I, don't have to rely as much on those things. So I think those are things where, it's not a matter of drawing a hard line all the time for everyone, but we can draw a hard line for ourselves and say, I want to make some decisions that are going to integrate my life ecologically, and that comes with a lot of other benefits too.
It's funny you mentioned the AC. My friends and I were just talking about that. She and my one friend had gone to Italy, and she's like, I hope you know that when you go over to Italy, they don't have air conditioning readily available,
Yeah,
so be prepared to be hot. And another thing that they do over there is they walk everywhere. So it's little things like that. Like I think that that's a great reminder that we can save electricity, but then we can also choose to walk places. Like my kids and I walk to school now, which is fabulous that we're blessed to
yeah,
live
that's
close to
great.
our school to be able to walk. Because I know that's not the case for everybody, but because we are close enough, why not take advantage of it instead of spending the money and wasting the gas to
Yeah,
drive 2 blocks?
yeah,
It
and
doesn't make
it's
a whole
not.
lot of sense.
Yeah, it's not just a matter of, trying to, I mean, there is an aspect of penance, of course, in the faith, and so we should be willing to take these things on. But there's also a way in which living more ecologically, living more in tune with the traditional way of life, the natural world, is actually just a happier life, right? Because like when you're walking, and this is my experience, living in a city, part of the reason we do is, we can walk to Central Market. I do walk to church on Sundays, and you meet your neighbors along the way. You have these interactions, and it's amazing how much that does build up community, and in a way that when you're all in your little box on the road, if you were driving by a neighbor, you're going 30 miles an hour, like how would you even wave and like have a little conversation or anything? So there's a lot of ways in which, yeah, that just builds up community, and that's really important too.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way to think about it. Is like when we're in our little box, it's just us. But when we're out and we're interacting with public, it's a great way to get over this epidemic of loneliness that we're
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
currently experiencing. Would you venture to say then that caring for creation is actually a form of evangelization, and if so, how?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think on a couple different fronts, like I was just saying, if we live more ecologically, and less sort of dependent on, rampant consumerism and industrialism, it does build up the kind of life where the gospel takes root more, right? Like, not to say that we can't, like take the parish example, right? When we all drive to a parish, right, and we worship there on a Sunday, then we all get in our cars and we often have to get right in them to make sure we're not parking anyone in, and then drive out back to our homes, right? If there's a neighbor or something walking by, they're not even going to get the chance to interact with us, right, in that way. And so like having rich communities of Catholics is certainly is really key to that, and that goes hand in hand with living in greater proximity to each other, and living in simpler ways. So that on one hand, I think that the community aspect that living ecologically inclines us to is really key. But then also just in the sense of authenticity, right? It's striking to me how a lot of people who are really into climate activism, that kind of stuff, are often very secular, or coming from a sort of socialist, progressive mindset, where they're certainly, they tend to see Christianity, not all of them, but some, as a generally sort of conservative force that just wants to cling to power and wealth, and isn't interested in this kind of thing. And I mean, that's simply not true, of course, but part of the reason that that perception is there is because, yes, we have this social teaching, but how do we live it out? Do people see the church, the Catholic Church, and Catholics as really authentically living out the gospel and the voluntary poverty of Christ? That's compelling, that's attractive to people, and I mean, we see it in the lives of the saints, but we ought to live that out more. And I think if we did, then there would be people who would naturally, who are already, inclined towards, a return to the earth, a return to nature, and, maybe are taking that in more of a new age direction, maybe are taking that more in a sort of, secular, socialist political direction. And then they find, oh, wait, like the Catholic Church has actually a really beautiful response that we see fellow Catholics, living out in this really holistic way. Maybe there's a space there for these desires that I have to get more in touch with nature and with the natural world.
I love that. Yeah, it's definitely we definitely need to shift the narrative because we maybe we're living it out quietly, personally, and that's why the secular world might have this view of us. But when we are vocal about it, and when we have, when we attend things like Ember Tides, or when we make these decisions to live more eco consciously, it becomes visible to others that yes, there is a place where you can combine your faith and being eco-conscious. And we talked a little bit about some of the concrete ways that we as individuals can do that, but let's say we wanted to take it a step further and work towards being more eco-conscious in our schools or in our parishes or at our workplace. What are some ways that we can do that, or where can we where do we start if we're going
Yeah.
to do that?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I did want to mention, of course, the ecological ember tides is something, that's not, the ember tides is an ancient devotion that goes back. Laudato Si, is this encyclical that comes from the Pope. This thing that we've created called ecological ember tides, it's something, I wrote with the help of others in our Catholic worker community. And it's some prayers and yeah, essentially, sort of, you know, devotion based on Laudato Si about the many things that Pope Francis calls us to pray for there. So, both praying for deliverance from natural disasters, praying in penance for our ecological sins, asking to lift up creation to God, offering that to Him, and asking for the grace to steward that well. So those are all things that should be part of our prayer lives, but haven't necessarily worked themselves into all of our prayer lives. So what we do is we have this, at St. Joe's here in Lancaster, a regular prayer service where we pray these ecological ember tides. Our deacon was at it recently, so it included some blessings of the elements. We have a little fire, earth, water, and air based off of the Canticle of St. Francis, which is an inspiration for Laudato Si, of course. And so, yeah, bringing those prayers to our parishes, I think, is something, the encyclical tells us to do, that we ought to be engaged in that ecological spirituality, and that there's this rich tradition of ecology in, many, many saints. I mean, St. Hildegard von Bingen, St. Francis, of course, many others, that we draw from in this. And so, we have this devotion that we've put together, and it's gotten the imprimatur from the bishop. So it's been officially approved in that way. So that's something certainly that people are welcome to join us at here at St. Joe's in Lancaster. But also if other parishes want to start that kind of thing, it's a resource that's out there. And then there's others as well, of course, that can make that a more regular part of our spiritual lives. So that's one thing. Certainly observing the Embertide fasts, I think, is a beautiful tradition. I know that there's several bishops throughout the country that have actually encouraged their faithful to do so. So it's the Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday, and there's four of them, around each season. So one can find, the explanation, if you look up the Ember Tides, of when those dates fall. And then, of course, that's the prayer element, putting that into practice. A lot of these things, I was mentioning about, trying to live what Pope Francis, he calls it, a new lifestyle, right? That can be done not just individually, but corporately. So, at parishes and such, we can, make decisions about, even just the decision of using, recyclable or, especially like compostable plates versus, styrofoam, when we have parish events, things like that. Yeah, that's a simple example, but if we take that to all of our sort of spending habits and the ways that we supply ourselves, that can make a big difference, especially when we have bigger institutions that just take the small level of research to say like, okay, like what's a better way we can do this, and maybe it costs a little bit more, right? Maybe it's a little bit more inconvenient, but yeah, I think those are all opportunities. I can think of some others too that I know other parishes have done. If you want me to list some other ideas as well.
No, those are fantastic. It reminds me of this book my son was reading called "If Everyone Did It," and it's
Yeah,
talking about like interrupting in class, if one person does it, it's not a big deal. But if everyone did it, or if somebody threw a piece of paper on the ground, one piece of paper is not a big deal. But if everybody did it, and when you think about that in terms of being eco-conscious, we might feel like a small contributing factor, but if everybody does it, then those little actions can add up really, really quickly. And like you said, it might be a little bit, I know people balk at it being cost ineffective up front, but when you think about the long-term effects of it, it's not that much. It's not that difficult.
Yeah. And something too that we have to be, there's a great line in Laudato Si. Pope Francis says something like, purchasing is always a moral and not simply an economic act, right? And so, as Catholics, we're willing to take on sacrifices for all sorts of things. We're willing to, not be able to, just do whatever we want on a Sunday afternoon. We're willing to not work right as much because we're going to, I'm going to leave time for Sabbath in my life. I'm going to be willing to do all sorts of different things that aren't going to be cost effective, right? Because that's not the narrative that runs my life. It's not about how much money can I get or save. It's about how do I glorify God, right? And, we buy beautiful vestments and candles for church. That's not, if we're just trying to pinch every penny, that wouldn't make any sense. But there's a reason to it. And so I think if we think about it in that sense of like, oh, this is actually something that matters. This is a moral choice I'm making to choose convenience and damaging the environment, or choosing, something that's more difficult, maybe more expensive, but is, caring for creation. I'm stewarding the creation that God gave us.
I love that. That's a really great reframe to think about it. Where we are obligated to care for this creation that God gave us. Otherwise, He wouldn't have put us in charge of it.
Yeah.
I love that. Well, Sean, thank you so much for your time and for sharing ecological empathize with us. I'm so happy that you opened my eyes to this, because this was, even though it's an old tradition, it was new to me. So thank you so much. And I hope whoever was listening was inspired to not only take part in something like this, but maybe start their own at their church.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on.
And that's our show. Candid Catholic Convos is brought to you by the Diocese of Harrisburg, hosted and sound engineered by me, Rachel Trochet, and produced by Rachel Bryson. If today's episode resonated with you, please share it on social media. You can tag us using @HBGDiocese. Make sure you also subscribe on your preferred listening platform so you never miss an episode. And if you'd like to support our production efforts, a donation to our diocesan annual campaign would benefit us greatly in continuing our ministry. Next week, we'll be showcasing a Catholic creator on the rise from right here in our diocese, using his gifts to evangelize online. So subscribe, keep praying for us, and we'll keep praying for you.